1 Timothy 2:9 says this, likewise also that women should adorn themselves with respectable apparel, with modesty and self-control, not with braided hair and gold or pearls or costly attire, but with what is proper for women who profess godliness with good works. So I have a couple comments on this right off the bat, SJ. So the first thing I would say is that the point Paul is making is that godliness is more important than beauty. Okay, just take that principle broadly before you start drilling down to exact applications. In terms of ordering your life and making sure you're getting the pieces and parts in the right places, Paul tells us godliness is more important than beauty. Okay, and that's great. That's something we need to remember and something we need to focus on. All right, the next thing I want you to see is that we ought not to over-apply what Paul is saying. Notice what he says here. Likewise also that women should adorn themselves with respectable apparel, with modesty and self-control, not with braided hair and gold or pearls or costly attire. A lot of people will use this as an argument to say that women should never wear jewelry and women should never, have a dress or a skirt that is above the knee or something like that. Well, let's compare all of Scripture. Proverbs 31 woman is very interesting. Right? Proverbs 31 is supposed to be wisdom personified. And she's supposed to be Lady Wisdom, perfect in all of her beauty. And listen to how she's discussed. The woman who fears the Lord, an excellent wife who can find. She is far more precious than jewels. The heart of her husband trusts in her, and he will have no lack or gain. She does him good and not harm all the days of his life. She seeks wool and flax and works with willing hands. She is like the ships of the merchant. She brings her food from afar. She works hard. Okay? She helps her family, supports them. She rises while it is yet night and provides food for her household and portions for her maidens. She considers a field and buys it. With the fruit of her hands, she plants a vineyard. Listen to this. She dresses herself with strength and makes her arms strong. She perceives that her merchandise is profitable. Her lamp does not go out at night. She puts her hands to the distaff, and her hands hold the spindle. She opens her hand to the poor and reaches out her hands to the needy. Notice a high emphasis on godliness, right? That's very similar to the language that Paul was using. She is not afraid of snow for her household, for all her household are clothed in scarlet. Now, wait a second. All her household are clothed in scarlet. That's kind of a statement of wearing, kind of wealthy clothes, right? Oh, let's continue. She makes bed coverings for herself. Her clothing is fine linen and purple. Okay, wait a second. That is costly, right? We know that her clothing being fine linen and purple. We know her household clothed in scarlet. That's not cheap, right? That's not living in rags. That is, actually dressing in a fairly costly way, right? Now let's compare that to Paul again. Not with braided hair and gold or pearls or costly attire. Okay, so once you start to take all of Scripture into account, you begin to see that it can be appropriate to wear costly attire. We just need to think about what sense in which Paul is using this language that comports with Proverbs 31. Okay, you need to put all of the Scriptures together. And so Paul's emphasis is not necessarily on just never wear clothing like that. Instead, his emphasis is on clothe yourself first with godliness, right? That is the key. That's the point. Now, we also, just like you said, we can look at the context of the situation. And there are plenty of commentaries that focus on context. So let's try to find a context commentary. Do we have one? Women to dress modestly. This is the Zondervan Illustrated Bible Background Commentary. It was customary for women in ancient Greek cities to dress up in their very finest for public worship festivals. Oh, okay, so for public worship festivals, people would wear their best clothing. Okay, got you. And Paul's saying that Christian worship is different in some way, shape, or form? Let's continue. For instance, the historian Herodotus remarks that the Athenian women gathered in a temple precinct at the summons of a tyrant in their best clothes as if they were off to a festival. The romance novel by Xenophon of Ephesus opens with a great procession in honor of the patron goddess of Ephesus, Artemis Ephesia, at which all of the young girls march in process in their very finest clothes. Oh, so there was some sort of relationship of them dressing up in their finest clothes for these pagan worship festivals. Okay. And what Paul is trying to draw a contrast with is your worship in the Christian church is different than in this pagan worship. We'll let him continue. For it was the custom at this festival to find husbands for the girls and wives for the young men. Even the cult statues of goddesses were adorned with great finery at public festivals. At Ephesus, the statue of Artemis was dressed by young girls who held an official title of adorner. In contrast to this prevailing practice, Paul instructs women, and by implication men as well, to focus their attention not on rich wardrobes, but on the inner beauty of Christian character, godliness. Remember? This instruction is not new or novel, as Ignatius of Antioch puts it. Christians are the new temple of God, appointed to be shrine bearers, Christ bearers, sanctity bearers, dressed up from head to toe in the commandments of Jesus Christ. There you go. There you go. So, the point is, the broader point is Christian worship is not like pagan worship. Okay, that's what he's saying. Here's what you guys do at pagan festivals. We're not going to do that in the church. Instead, and he uses a play on words, dress yourself in godliness. That's what matters most. Okay? But those statements, not with braided hair or costly garments, those are statements of emphasis, right? A lot of people will take phrases out of Paul and just, boom, drop them in there. You're not supposed to be wearing fine clothes. Who determines what fine clothes are? Am I currently wearing fine clothes? It depends on who you ask. How much was this shirt? How much was this jacket? Does that count as fine clothes or not? Depends on who you ask, right? There are gradations of these things throughout the world. And so it's not simple to define that dress counts as fine clothes, that dress does not. That's not straightforward or easy to understand or recognize, okay? So we need to, compare that with what Paul's larger point was. That is, focus on godliness first, and then afterwards, you can just ensure that you are not dressing yourself up for church in terms of trying to celebrate pagan practices. Okay, that's the key idea. Now, you can have if somebody were convicted in their heart, like, yeah, I was just going to church, in my fanciest Versace, and I felt convicted about that. I'm not going to tell you not to feel convicted about that. If God's Spirit put that on you to correct that, then God bless you and live how God is calling you to live, okay? But we need to try and understand a broader principle or a broader perspective, okay? What was Paul's main point? How do we understand what he was saying? And how does it line up with the rest of Scripture? Kind of like Proverbs 31, which her household is dressed in scarlet, she's dressed in fine linen and purple. There must be a sense in which that's okay. The fact of the matter is there's a sense in which you can wear costly garments that is immoral and counter to godliness, and there's a way in which you can wear costly garments that is not morally compromising at all. And that, I think, is where the discussion needs to be had. Let's continue. Not with braided hair. In Paul's day, hairstyles were undergoing a radical change. Earlier in the Greek world, women's hairstyles were simple. The hair was pinned in the back and held up with a simple band or scarf. In public, respectable women would wear veils on top of their head, which fell down the back to the shoulders and hid any elaborate hairdo. Only a shady woman or one in mourning would appear in public with her hair untied and unveiled. However, in the mid-1st century, women throughout the empire were copying the elaborate braided and ornamental hairdos of the Roman empresses, many of whom were quite scandalous. Here's an example of how that changed. A statue of a Roman lady with a braided hairstyle. So you can see it was changing into this approach. So, again, it is not an absolute declaration here. It is instead a matter of cultural situation and emphasis. I don't think if you have braids in your hair that you're violating the scriptures. But somebody could point to the scriptures and say, look, it says not with braided hair. You have braided hair, therefore you're wrong. What is Paul's intention? What is his point? What is his purpose? Oh, women were really focusing on their outward appearance. They were focusing on their beauty. And Paul's saying, no, focus on your godliness. That is what matters the most. So again, we need to be careful how we apply the scriptures to our modern situation, our modern lifestyles. Okay? What was flaunting your wealth or your beauty or your status in Paul's time is not necessarily the same as flaunting those things in our time. And notice his focus on godliness. You could also dress pretty trashy and show up to church, but have this attitude of not godliness, but focusing on beauty. That's possible as well. And it is not as though if you're not wearing braided hair or golden pearls, you're good to go, right? So for example, let's say your hair wasn't braided, but you had a different hairstyle that reflected a very pompous attitude, a very outward focus on beauty alone. And instead of gold and pearls, you instead dressed in titanium and silver. Oh, I'm not violating the scriptures. Well, you're violating the spirit of the scriptures. You're violating what Paul is pointing out. Okay. So those are some of the important concepts surrounding this. And I think there are two tendencies. I think there's a tendency to swing the pendulum too far in one direction and make it all cultural. Oh, that was just cultural at the time. You can do whatever you want. I think that dismisses too much of what Paul is trying to say. But I think there's a tendency to swing the pendulum too far in the other direction. And with perhaps an overly literalistic hermeneutic, say, oh, it explicitly says braided hair, gold and pearls. Therefore, you can't wear your gold wedding ring. You can't wear your hair in braids, right? There's a happy medium there where we honor the spirit of what Paul was saying without going over the top in our application. And that should be the focus. That should be the focus.